relational databases provide a way to store the structured data in the table format. It also helps us establish and identify and understand relationships among those different tables. What SQL or structured query language does is it enables us to primarily interact with this data. Although it's kind of a simplified or simplistic view of the power of RDBMS, but I think it's at this point of time a good enough starting point to understand that SQL is a way by which you can access and retrieve information from relational databases. Now, what SQLite database does is it provides support for interacting with the data that is stored in the table format in the RDBMS, like what SQL does. Also, it has a very standardized way to interact with the data, and this kind of a support is already embedded in the file. What that means is that any programming language that can use SQLite can also use SQL to work with that data. As we know that SQL is a declarative language which is mostly used to either create or manage or update things like that, and it's essentially a way to query a data or query the database. So a declarative language describes what needs to be accomplished rather than how it should be done, right? So we will see some examples of how to structure your database with SQL. So in SQL, there are a lot of important concepts that you need to be aware of. We spoke about what we really mean by a table. A table is nothing but a combination of rows and columns. So that's the first thing. We now know also what exactly is the definition of a field. We have also discussed what exactly is a record, or this is also you can think of as the rows in a particular table. And on the other hand, we also have columns. Now, each record that we have in a particular table has a primary key. Now, the concept of a primary key is very important in understanding of databases and tables. Now, what a primary key does is it helps us to uniquely identify a particular record. A primary key is a way by which we can establish relationships among different tables. Although it's directly often generated by the database engine, it doesn't always have to be. You could define your own primary key for a corresponding table that you are using. Also, another important term in the context of databases is what we call as query, and this is what is also contained in the name of SQL, which is structured query language. So querying a database means you are asking certain questions to the database. Now, what that exactly means is that the database contains different information in the field form of tables, and what you are essentially writing a query for is to extract certain relevant and interesting questions, answers to certain relevant and interesting questions that is of your interest. So that is what a query essentially does. Now, the most important aspect of databases, and especially about RDBMS, is that of persistent storage of data. So there are a lot of properties of databases, and we have discussed about these properties in the earlier video that we discussed. So you can go back and check out that video to understand what different properties are like. So there are properties like consistency, atomicity, and a lot of other things which a database needs to have in an ideal scenario. Now, the next most important concept in databases is that a database is a collection of tables, and what helps interlink these tables is what we are calling as relationships. Now, the concept of relationships is also covered in that earlier video, and we have discussed about a specific diagram or a logical flow which is known as the ER diagram or the entity relationship model. It's often called ER diagram or ER model. Now what it does is it helps us establish or look at different tables in databases, and based on the primary keys that they have, it tries to establish relationships among tables. Now, relationships can depend in a number of ways. It could be one-to-one relationships, it could be one-to-many relationships, it could be many-to-one relationship, or it could be many-to-many relationships. And this is often termed as the cardinality of your database.